Hi, Temple friends. I'm Sarah Klein. I've been a member of Temple Road of Shalom for around 16 years, ever since my kids were really little, and they are in college now. Before I begin making my challah dough, I just need to put a plug in for the youth activities at Temple. Both of my kids were very, very involved in youth group, both Tristy and Nifty, and it was fabulous. So if anybody wants to talk with me about that or has questions about making challah, please look me up in the members only directory, which you can find on the Temple website. Okay, so today is Thursday, and I am making my challah dough because I never make it on Friday. Who has time on Friday, especially if you're working, to make homemade challah? I usually make it on Wednesday. I used to work 4 days a week. Make my dough on Wednesday, fresh challah on Friday. But today we're doing it on Thursday, that works too. So this is a recipe that I've been making for over 20 years. It's very forgiving. If you've never made challah, I recommend trying this. But if you have another recipe that you love, same techniques will work too. And we're going to post the recipe. This recipe makes 1 large loaf or 2 very respectably sized medium loaves. Last week we made 1 loaf of challah, and with the other half of the dough we made cinnamon rolls for Saturday morning. So it's a very versatile dough as well. Okay, so I'm going to get started. The first thing that I do is I proof the yeast, and I buy my yeast I buy it loose. It's not in packets. It's a relatively large package. It's the SAF red label. I also like the gold label. And I get it from King Arthur flour. It lives in the freezer for a really long time. I think I bought this a 1.5 years ago, which is why it is a good idea to proof your yeast. So also I want to say I already washed my hands using the WHO 6-step method. So always wash your hands before you begin. And I also measured out 1/2 cup of warm water. And the way I do this is I have an Instahot on my sink, and I do half. My camera person's laughing at me. I do half Instahot and half just tap water, because the warm water can actually be fairly warm, warmer than you might think. So I'm going to measure out a tablespoon of yeast. If you buy it in the packets, just use a packet, it's fine. Tablespoon of yeast and a teaspoon of sugar. Sweetheart, I would rather you stand over there. And that goes in there, and I neglected to bring anything to stir it with, so I'll just stir it with this. This is not my usual space for baking. I usually bake over on a different countertop. So that's going to sit there, and the recipe says you should let it bubble up to the top of the measuring cup. We'll know whether this yeast is active long before it reaches the top of the measuring cup, but that's called proofing your yeast, because you want some proof, some evidence that your yeast is still fresh and active. All right, so that's the story with that. Now I'm going to measure out 3 cups of flour, and you can use all-purpose flour or you can use a combination, which I'm going to do today. I am going to use 1/2 and 1/2 all-purpose flour and white wheat flour. And if you haven't experienced white wheat flour, I suggest you give it a try when life is back to normal. Okay, now to measure the flour, I never bother to sift it, but I do fluff it up like this. And in fact, we took a class, we've taken 2 baking classes at King Arthur Flour Cooking School in Vermont, and they recommend that you fluff up your flour, and then you want to be sure you use a dry ingredient measuring cup, not the liquid measuring cup. So you fluff up your flour, and then you never scoop like that, because that'll compress your flour. So you fluff it up, and then you shake it into the cup. Although, to be honest, with this recipe, I don't think precision is that important, but we'll do it this way anyway. Fluff it up. So that's 2 all-purpose. And this is not so fluffy. It's less fluffy. So this recipe uses about 4 cups of flour altogether, but we start with 3. And I use a KitchenAid stand mixer with the dough hook. I know some people use the Cuisinart, and in fact, this recipe, which was given to me by a friend who took a challah baking class at her synagogue, not Temple Road Shalom, many, many years ago, and it says to use the food processor with the dull blade. So that's our flour. There's 3 tablespoons of sugar. I'm gonna throw in here. 1, 2, 3. And I did put the sugar in with the yeast when I was proofing it, I think, right? And a 1/2 teaspoon of salt. And you never measure your salt over your mixing bowl, but I'm sure you all already know that. I just remember when my mom taught me that, so I always remind my kids. Okay, so we do that, and then you can put this on the mixer and turn it on to stir it up, or I'm gonna run over here for 1 sec. You can just use a whisk or something to just mix these ingredients together. So that's our dry ingredients are now mixed. And we'll take a look at our yeast. It seems to be fluffing up, which is what we want. We're going to be adding that to this bowl along with 2 eggs. And 1/3 of a cup of oil. I'm going to go ahead and dump this in so I can reuse this measuring cup and not have to wash another thing. So that's our yeast and water mixture. Oh, I should have mentioned this SAF yeast is actually instant yeast, and it is what the King Arthur Flour Baking School recommends, either the red or the gold. And I'm glad that I have a whole bunch of yeast in my freezer because I understand it's hard to get these days. All right, so now 1/3 of a cup of vegetable oil. I use canola, and I can't read the thing. So that's that. And now a 1/4 cup of water, and this is just like room temperature or tap water. You already added your warm water to dissolve the yeast. This is just more water for moisture. Doing a tour in my kitchen. 1/4 cup. I usually bake over there, which is very close to the sink. All right, so I'm gonna put this in, turn the mixer on. Maybe know what you wanna. We're gonna turn the mixer on and this is just like stirring. This is to mix it together. My mom, when I was growing up, my mom actually baked all of our bread, and I always remember the first step after she put the ingredients together was like stirring it with a giant spoon, which was very difficult. She sometimes like needed my brother or my father to help with stirring, and that's what I've always thought of this step as. This is not the kneading. This is the stirring before we add our additional flour. Making sure the yeast is evenly distributed. There's a very professional camera person here. Let me get my flour in there better. Okay. This is not the most interesting part. So some people make challah in a bread maker, and I've done that as well. You can use the bread maker for the mixing and the rising. Take it out and braid it, and then bake it in the oven. Okay, so this is like a very wet concoction, and it's pretty. Oops, there's more flour. I was gonna say this is a darker brown color than you know, if we had used all purpose, because remember we have some wheat, even though it's white wheat, it's still a darker color than the all purpose flour. Okay, so now the recipe says to add enough flour not to be sticky, and that most likely it will take another cup of flour, and you should add it small amounts at a time. So my experience with making challah in the KitchenAid is that you could add flour, you could add a lot of flour, and it will still be sticky. It's the mixer incorporates the flour, and you can make the mistake of adding more flour than is ideal, and that's one of the mistakes I've made in the past is, you know, trying to create dough that's not sticky. I've ended up making bread that was tougher than what I would prefer. So, and I've never added less than a cup at this stage. So what I tend to do is add another cup and deal with some slightly sticky dough, and I'll show you my method for making it easier to handle. I'm just going to throw this in. So now we're actually kneading. It's going to take a little while to incorporate. I don't have any specific length of time that I keep the mixer on for. I just kind of look at it and think about whether it seems to be, you know, all kind of hanging together, and whether it, I don't know, just kind of feels right. So probably if I wasn't filming, I would do it for another minute, but it seems like that would be boring. So I think we're good. But this is sticky. Like, if you, Noah, can you show? Like, this is gonna be hard to handle the way it is. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna turn it out onto a floured board and just knead it very briefly by hand. Sometimes I don't even bother. Sometimes I just like flour my hands and pat it around the outside. I just do this so that it's easier to handle. All out with my spatula onto my floured countertop. Hopefully this will all work. It won't be too sticky. So this bowl is going to be a little challenging to clean, and you do want to be careful not to put flour or the dough down your drain, because flour and water can get very thick and paste-like, and it can clog up your pipes. So when I clean up, I always try to get as much flour as I can, whether it's from my hands or from the countertop or the bowls, into the trash, not the sink. Okay. Oh, really stuck on there. I have another big, this is a harder plasticky scraper. Really don't want to leave this behind for all the reasons we just discussed, and because it's like another bite of bread right there. So, all right, so now I'm gonna just a couple little, I mean, it's really already kneaded, but this is just to get the texture a little more manageable for tomorrow when we're shaping it and we deal with it. But if I had added that little bit more flour in the mixer, I don't know why, but it wouldn't have improved the texture. It would have remained quite sticky. So this is just much easier. So I have a dough bucket that I sprayed earlier with vegetable oil spray. You can use any bowl. It doesn't have to be a special dough bucket. And you want to put, so it needs to be oiled. I sprayed it. You can just pour a little oil in and mix it, spread it around. And I'm going to put my dough in, and then I'm going to flip the dough over. And then you would, if you're using a bowl, you would cover it with saran wrap. My dough bucket has a cover. And I'm going to put it in the fridge, and it's going to rise until we're ready to shape it tomorrow. And like I said, you can let your dough rise in the fridge for a couple of days. And in fact, I read an article in Cooks Illustrated once that recommended for better structure and flavor. There's a whole science behind it, but I've just always done this because I don't have time on Friday to do the whole process. So it'll rise slowly in the fridge, and tomorrow we'll shape it. So my camera person paused in the filming while I divided the dough into 10 balls using the kitchen scale. It's kind of a time-consuming process if you don't, kind of judge it just right. So I had 10 balls, and I rolled out 4 of them into roughly even lengths. And when you're rolling it out, you can just roll it along your countertop, or you can pick it up and roll it like that. It comes out, in my experience, more evenly if you do it on the countertop. And sometimes you need to let the dough rest a little bit, so you might roll it out and then it'll shrink back, and just let that piece rest while you roll another one. You might have to revisit each one a couple times to get them the length you want. So this is going to be a round challah that is woven. And I'm going to place my my pieces of dough kind of in a, are you pointed down so you
I can either do close in, or I can do both you and the braids.
I think it should be.
Let's do that.
Okay. So we start that part over, or have our conversation? So you put it like tic-tac-toe, and then just lift over and under so you can see this middle part. So we have our tic-tac-toe that's woven a little bit, and what I'm going to do now is I'm going to start with this one, which is under, and I'm going to put it over that one. I'm going to take this one, which is under, and I'm going to put it over. Take this one over. Okay, so we just went around one time, and now we're going to go around in the other direction. So take the one that's under and put it over. Take the one that's under, put it over. This guy's a little too long. We'll deal with that later. Put it over. And I will keep going around until my strands are kind of all used up. I'll stretch them a little bit. So I keep picking up the one that's under and then putting it over. So this is about it. So now twist the ends together, because because we don't want this. This guy is just way too long. I don't know what happened, but it's okay. Things do not have to be perfect to taste good. So, you see, I have these two lumps. I'm gonna tuck them underneath. Beautiful. And I usually put parchment on my cookie sheets. I ran out of parchment a few weeks ago, and since we're not going to the store, I just sprayed a little of the vegetable oil spray on it. So that's this one, and I'll go ahead and cover it now. For the second rise, you want to be sure that your dough doesn't dry out. So my experience has been if I put a tea towel over it, it just gets too dry and doesn't rise as well. So I'm going to take a piece of saran wrap and spray it, and then flip it over and put it pretty loosely, because again, the goal is for the bread to double in size. So we want to make sure it has plenty of space, but we also want to make sure it's covered so it doesn't dry out. Okay, so now I have 6 of these to roll out. And, all right. So now I have 6 roughly even pieces, and I'm going to arrange them this way. May not be quite as even as I would like, but that's okay. Ooh, this one is a little lumpy. Okay, so I'm pressing them together at the top, but I kind of have 2 branches, 3 each, and I'm going to take the outside pieces and cross them over like this. So now what I'm going to do is this, starting on the side that has the piece that's on top. I'm going to take the outside piece and put it up, and I'm going to bring this piece that's on top on the opposite side and bring it down to the center. So then I'm going to start with the left side, bring the outside piece over to the right and up, and bring the piece that's up on the right down into the center. I kind of say to myself in my head when I do this that like I'm putting this up and then I'm replacing it. Up and replacing. Although it's going to a different position, that's just the way I always think about it. So you work from the outside and you bring it back down to the inside. The outside goes up, this comes down to the inside. Okay, up, down. It never comes out even at the bottom, ever. Up, down, and then squish everything together and tuck it under. And then I usually kind of nudge it together because I don't like a long skinny loaf. I would rather a loaf that was a little wider, so I like to kind of nudge it together. And then this one I am also going to cover. Spray so it doesn't stick. Ta-da! So you can just leave these in a warm place to rise if you're doing it on Friday. If you braid them on Thursday night, you'll want to put them in the refrigerator so that they'll rise slowly overnight. And if your oven has a bread-proof feature and you're in a hurry, you can use the bread-proof feature. If your oven does not have a bread-proof feature, you can put them in the oven and turn the oven light on. And if your oven light only goes on if the door's open, you can prop the door open a tad. The oven light will warm the oven enough to just create a nice warm atmosphere that will accelerate the rising process. So I'm going to just leave them out on the countertop. If I was in more of a hurry, I would go ahead and use the bread proof feature. And I think we're going to pause the filming now and come back when it's time to bake. So it's been about an hour, and the 2 loaves have risen to about double their size. And I have preheated the oven to 375. I'm now going to brush the loaves with an egg wash, which is just an egg that I beat up with a little bit of water in it. And I'm going to do that as gently as I can because I don't want to deflate my dough. And after I put the egg on, I'm going to sprinkle some coarse sugar, some sesame seeds, and some kosher salt on top. Some people really like to use everything bagel seasoning. My family does not care for that. Sometimes I'll do a mixture of like white and black sesame seeds. Sometimes nothing, but you can feel free to, after you put the egg on, feel free to sprinkle on different seeds or toppings. So trying to get pretty good coverage. And the egg just makes it, gives it that glossy, shiny coating. This pastry brush is made out of silicone. Just saying. I've had it for a while. I like it because you can put it in the dishwasher versus the other kinds of bristles. And after I do this, I'm going to put it in the oven for a total of 20 minutes at 375, but I'm going to set the timer for 10 minutes because at 10 minutes I'm going to take them out and switch the racks, put the one that was on the upper rack down to the lower rack and spin it around. If I was just doing 1 loaf, I would still set the timer for 10 minutes and I would just take it out and turn it around to be sure that it bakes evenly. So when I'm doing 2, I take them out, turn them around, and switch upper and lower. I buy my sesame seeds at Penzeys. If you haven't been to Penzeys in Falls Church, I love it. They have great spices, great recipes online. Okay. Sesame seeds. Hi. A little bit of spillage. Coarse sugar. Hey, too much. And some salt. All right, so I'm going to pop these in the oven, and then in 20 minutes I'll take them out and we'll show you what they look like. Here we are after 20 minutes in the oven. As I said, at 10 minutes I took them out and switched them around from the top to the bottom rack and left to right. And 20 minutes is really all that this recipe takes. If we can get a close-in of the round challah, you can see the woven, and then the 6th strand opened up a little bit, and I think that's because I didn't knead it for very long. You might remember that I turned off the mixer pretty quickly in the interest of time. Some additional kneading would have prevented this kind of opening up. But anyway, there we go. We're looking forward to eating them at dinner tonight. We'll probably freeze one for to eat later. And just to recap, if you don't have time to make your challah from start to finish on Friday, you can make the dough several days in advance and let it rise in the fridge. You can braid it Thursday night and put it back in the fridge to rise some more, or take it out on Friday and braid it and bake it on Friday. The couple of things that I've done in the past that haven't worked out that well, that I wanted to warn you about so you could avoid, is don't add too much flour when you're kneading it in your electric mixer, because too much flour will make the dough dry and tough. Make sure you knead it for long enough or your braid will open up like this. And watch that second rise, because if you let it rise too much for the second rise, it'll end up kind of rising and falling. So you just have to learn from experience, really, but there is kind of a sweet spot, and if you let it rise too much, it'll kind of collapse. Also be very, very gentle when you put the egg wash on, or your bread may collapse. It still tastes good, so but you just want to try to watch that. Anyway, that's the process, and if you want to email me with questions, I'd be happy to answer them. And Shabbat Shalom.